Because the large crankshaft had broken again, and because imported spare parts are very expensive in Pakistan, to minimize losses, the car owner had no hesitation in sending it to a repair shop. He was willing to pay 5,000 rupees to have it reattached. Considering the length of the crankshaft after joining, the first step the worker takes is to note the original dimensions to prevent the crankshaft from becoming too short after welding. For this relatively large diameter crankshaft shaft, the first step is to smooth out the rough fracture surface using a lathe and a steady rest. This is to ensure the concentricity of the subsequent connection is not affected. Although this is a crankshaft repair, the reattachment method is similar to that of a disabled truck rear axle, reattaching the axle shaft through the center hole. To increase the force-bearing area of the hole, after drilling with a large drill bit, the worker proceeds to widen it using an internal boring tool. This removes any remaining ridges on the inner wall and makes the hole diameter equal to the radius of the axle shaft. On the outside of the hole to be welded, the worker cuts the cutting surface into a bevel, slope, to expand the electrode welding area. Next, a half shaft, a used axle, is used as a connector. Because the outer diameter of this half shaft differs from the diameter of the crankshaft bore, the surface of the half shaft needs to be cut and shaped using a lathe tool to match the bore depth. The worker then uses a grooving tool to cut the back of the half shaft. This is the key to connecting the crankshaft bores. After the worker has successfully divided the two half shafts, a cylindrical connecting component, the exact dimensions of which match the hole, is hammered completely into the bottom of the hole. The strength of the connection will remain unaffected only if the internal parts are not hollow. Because the same connection method on both sides is considered insufficiently strong, the connecting cylindrical surface that will fit into the crank side must be threaded. This threaded connection will not affect the position of the crank. With skill, the worker can now process the crank end. To ensure the crankshaft remains balanced while rotating on the lathe, so that the crank does not touch the lathe and avoid the effects of eccentric rotation, the worker welds a counterweight to the end. Next, the entire end face is removed, cut off. Although the cuts at both ends will reduce the length slightly, this will be recapped by the connecting cylinder. Referring to the predetermined hole diameter data, the worker only needs to be careful with the drilling depth, as too deep or too shallow will affect the final result. Once the marks on the tip and the drill bit are aligned, the depth has met the connection standard. Since this end requires threading, the worker needs to cut identical internal threads on the inner wall, according to the thread pitch on the connecting cylinder, to avoid looseness when the threads are connected. After the worker quickly machined the crankshaft ends, the shafts could now be connected by turning them. Although the thread provided on the connecting cylinder was quite long, the internal threads didn't jam at all. Once the bevels on both ends were perfectly aligned, the worker measured the total length of the connected crankshaft with a tape measure. If the data and concentricity are not affected, the workers then completely fill all the bevel grooves with welding electrodes. Because the welding area covers half the end face, to prevent the internal cylinder from breaking, they use welding electrodes with good elasticity and hardness to ensure the crankshaft can still withstand internal torque. Next, the welds were cut flush with a lathe chisel to ensure they were flush with the shaft surface so the crank could be installed and used normally. Finally, to smooth out the rough cut surface, the workers repeatedly used an angle grinder until the surface was smooth and even. The broken crankshaft was finally reattached. What do you think of the craftsmanship of these Pakistani workers?